Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening with Lukoil, which is the second largest oil company in Russia, the largest private oil company, one of the biggest in the world. And the reason why this is so important is that before the sanctions, Lukoil was producing around 1.6 million barrels of oil per day. That's actual production. And it was also handling around 1 million barrels per day through its refineries. So 2.6 million barrels per day. That equates to more than 2% of the global export supplies. So Lukoil is a really big player. And the reason why it was really important to the Russian economy is, firstly, it had established quite a significant overseas presence through lots of different acquisitions over the last 30 years. And that then meant that it was bringing in lots of foreign currency. And foreign currency for a country like Russia, where its currency, the ruble that nobody really wants to use, is really valuable. So it was a big player. And a lot of people have asked me about some fuel networks in the USA. So I thought it was worth going through exactly what assets Lukoil has. So if we firstly talk about the upstream assets, and when we're talking about oil, we have upstream, which is basically the raw production of oil, and then downstream, which are things like refineries and fuel stations. So in terms of the upstream assets, it had quite a lot in a lot of different countries. So in Iraq, it owns 75% of an oil field that produces 480,000 barrels per day. In the United Arab Emirates, it owns 10% of a gas project producing around 40,000 barrels per day equivalent. As I mentioned a few days ago, it's easier to talk about gas in barrels per day equivalents rather than what gas cubic meters there are, because nobody really knows how much that is. In Azerbaijan, it had a 25% stake in a gas field which is producing around 120,000 barrels per day equivalent of gas. In Uzbekistan, it's got two different gas fields producing around about 100,000 barrels per day equivalent. In Kazakhstan, it's got lots of different stakes in a variety of different projects. And in Mexico, it's got multiple offshore blocks, which are early stage exploration. But in total, around 1 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent per day being produced from these upstream assets. Now, in terms of the downstream assets, in Bulgaria, it has one of the biggest refineries that's producing around 190,000 barrels per day. And that's really important to the supply in Bulgaria and the surrounding regions. In Romania, it's also got one of the biggest refineries producing around 18,000 barrels per day. And in the Netherlands, it's got a 45% stake in the Zeeland refinery producing 90,000 barrels per day. So a lot of different fingers in a lot of different pies. And in terms of those retail networks, the gas stations, because certainly I got quite a few messages from people in the US saying my local gas station is Lukoil. Well, there's 194 Lukoil branded sites across the northeast of the USA. In addition to that, they've got 600 stations in Turkey, 320 in Romania, 200 in Bulgaria, plus some depots, and 110 in Serbia, and around 40 in North Macedonia. So over 1,500 stations across the world. Now, in terms of what's happened with Lukoil, well, it was sanctioned directly by the USA on the 23rd of October. And within 3 days of that happening, it was announced that Gunvor, which is technically a Swedish company, well, it's based in Switzerland, but it's run by a Swedish owner, had agreed a deal to buy all of those overseas assets, and it was reported that the price being paid was $22 billion, which is a fraction of what Lukoil paid for it. We don't know exactly what the value is, but in a previous video, I went through some of the press releases from the days when they were buying things, and it looked like it was hundreds of billions of dollars. I'm getting my millions and billions mixed up. So 22 billion was an absolute steal. And to do a deal of that size within 3 days, you have to have a very close relationship with the company, because who can work out what the value of something is and who can agree a deal of that nature within a short space of time? So let's hear from the chief executive of Gunvor, who was being questioned by Bloomberg as to whether or not this deal was actually going to be allowed to go through.
And we have agreed with Lukoil to acquire all of their international assets. There's no Russian assets included in this, just international assets. And we are now in discussions with the relevant authorities to present this transaction. We believe it is satisfy all the concerns that may arise from a transaction of this magnitude and giving the parties involved. So we're pretty confident that this deal actually ticks off the critical boxes in that one.
Do you think that the US government will be satisfied that this deal isn't going to be benefiting Russia?
Sorry, that they will be...
The US government will be satisfied that this deal won't be benefiting Russia?
Yeah, it won't. Because obviously, I can't go into the detail, but it is obviously, we are assuring them that this is not the case. And it's a clean break. The moment the deal is done, that's it. We will do that, and we will be in a fully transparent dialogue with the US authorities and other relevant authorities.
Yeah.
So the question that was raised there was whether or not the US would believe that Russia wasn't benefiting from the transaction. Well, firstly, Russia was going to benefit from the transaction because it was going to be paid something for these assets, $22 billion. But there were also a lot of reports in the press that it was rumoured that the deal had a buyback option whereby the Russian authorities could actually buy back those assets at some point in the future once or if sanctions are released against Russia. So the chief exec was basically saying, oh no, it'll all be fine. I'm sure the US authorities will be cool with this outcome. Now, in terms of Gunvor Group, I thought it was worth just looking into the history of the company to see whether or not there's any links to Russia. Well, it was founded in 2000 by a guy called Gennady Timchenko, who's a long-time close friend of Vladimir Putin, alongside the Swedish trading guy Torbjörn Torquist, who you've just seen talking. So we had a Russian who's basically one of the big oligarchs in Russia, founding it with somebody who's not Russian to give it sort of international flavour. It's based in Geneva, and it quickly became one of the largest oil traders in the world because it was handling around 1/3 of Russian oil exports. So basically, this was an overseas business that was established to handle a lot of Russian oil. And it was set up by one of the oligarchs from Russia. So essentially what we've got here is an overseas Russian business. Now, its turnover went from $0 to $40 billion within 7 years. So that's quite incredible. And of course, the reason it did that is because it was handling so much of Russia's oil, because it's an oil trader. So it's basically placing all of that oil, doing deals, effectively being a marketing company for Russian oil. Now, interestingly, in 2014, the Russian founder, the oligarch, exited the business. So he sold out of all of his stake to the Swedish CEO that you've just seen because he was about to be sanctioned by the USA directly. So he was identified as an oligarch. He was seen as being somebody who obviously had some involvement in Russia's invasion of Crimea back in 2014. So he sold all of his shares at that point because if he hadn't have done that, after he'd been sanctioned, he wouldn't have been able to receive any money for them. So he cashed out. So technically, he's no longer involved in the business, but obviously the business is still the business. So it still handles a lot of Russian oil, and it's currently generating around about $130 billion per year in revenues. So that is a significant player. Now, in terms of the US's response to this proposed acquisition, the Treasury Department on the 6th of November issued this statement on X, which reads, President Trump has been clear that the war must end immediately. As long as Putin continues the senseless killings, the Kremlin's puppet, Gunvor, will never get a license to operate and profit. So basically the US Treasury Department is saying that Gunvor's just it's linked to Russia. Putin is telling Gunvor what to do, so there is no chance on earth that we're going to allow this transaction to happen. Now, Gunvor responded on X to that statement saying, the Treasury Department's statement about Gunvor is fundamentally misinformed and false. Gunvor is and has always been open and transparent about its ownership and business, and has for more than a decade actively distanced itself from Russia. Well, that decade is since Russia was sanctioned following the invasion of Crimea. Stopped trading in line with sanctions, sold off Russian assets, and publicly condemned the war in Ukraine. We welcome the opportunity to ensure this clear misunderstanding is corrected. In the meantime, Gunvor withdraws its proposal for Lukoil's international assets. So the deal is now dead as a result of the Treasury's statement about Gunvor being a puppet of the Kremlin. Now, it's interesting, I think, because the US authorities are not prepared to let these assets fall into the hands of somebody who's linked to Russia. But also, as I said in a previous video, they won't be prepared to allow the payment of any money to Russia because Lukoil is sanctioned. So you can't deal with Lukoil. No international bank would process that payment because you would be sending money to a sanctioned entity. So it's impossible for the deal to actually go through. So even if somebody else came in, BP or Shell or ExxonMobil came in and said, okay, we'll buy all of these assets, it wouldn't be able to be approved. There's no way you can deal with a sanctioned entity. So in terms of what this means for Lukoil, this is seriously bad news because they've now got a cash flow crisis. They were receiving billions of dollars from all of these assets. These are really valuable investments that Lukoil had, bringing in a ton of cash. But more importantly, it was bringing in a lot of overseas revenue. So lots of revenue in dollars and euros and revenue that's really useful to both Lukoil and the Russian authorities because nobody wants to deal in rubles and Russia can only print rubles, so it needs to get its hands on other people's currencies. So that's a big problem. Also, it's lost the control of all of these assets. They're now being frozen in all of the different countries because, as we touched on before, these assets are actually really important to all of those different countries. So whether you're talking about Bulgaria or Romania or Kazakhstan, even the filling stations, if you think about, if that's your local filling station that is a Lukoil branded company, then you need to go and be able to fill up your vehicle. If all of those filling stations, the 1,500, close and don't receive any more fuel, then that's going to cause problems in those areas. So something needs to be done with these assets really quickly. And the most likely outcome now is that they're going to be nationalized, seized by the authorities in each of the different countries, and then given to somebody else to operate them so that they would be a clean break away from Lukoil. So you'd have to change some of the supply arrangements if Lukoil is supplying those service stations, for example. Well, it's unlikely, I think, in the USA that the Lukoil service stations are using Russian oil because obviously it's been sanctioned for a long time. Even though Lukoil's only been sanctioned within the last few weeks, I don't think Russian oil has been entering the USA for quite a long time. So what we're seeing here is basically all of these assets being taken away from Lukoil. They won't receive any money for it, but they're losing a lot more than that. They're losing their operational control, they're losing the cash flow, they're losing overseas revenue. And obviously from a reputational point of view, then Lukoil is no longer a global player. And that's what it really wanted to achieve. That was why it made all of these acquisitions, so that it could be a genuine global business. But that's not happening anymore. It's now just a Russian business. But this is also really bad news for the Russian economy for the reasons I've just mentioned, that Russia is no longer getting all of that overseas revenue, those different currencies, but Lukoil is shrinking in size. It won't be making anywhere near the level of profits it's made in the past. So therefore, it won't pay as much tax, won't contribute as much to the Russian economy, and therefore GDP will be impacted negatively. But also, it's damaging Russia's reputation as a big player globally in oil. And I think that's important. And Russia had quite a lot of influence in countries like Romania and Bulgaria because of Lukoil's presence. However, that's now going to be eradicated. So it's a further blow to Russia, its reputation and its cash flow. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because we were talking about Lukoil being sanctioned. We then talked about the Gunvor deal that had been put together in a rapid space of time. I don't think I can remember any other deals of that sort of size, $22 billion. And that was actually a massive undervaluation of those assets. They're really worth hundreds of billions of dollars. That was put together within 3 days. Now, Lukoil didn't put together an information memorandum and give everybody lots of details as to how all of the assets were performing and what sort of cash flow they were bringing in. So the only entity that could have put together a deal in that space of time is somebody that's very close to what's going on in Russia. You would need to have a good handle, firstly, on what Lukoil owns, and then secondly, what those assets are producing, what all the legal jurisdictions are, how you're going to actually effect that transfer, what it means in terms of profitability from your point of view, what sort of capex that you'd need to invest into those businesses. There are a multitude of different factors that you need to put into a multi-jurisdictional, multinational acquisition of this nature. That's something that I used to do in the past when, before I started doing YouTube, I was involved in international finance for multi-billion dollar deals. And some of those deals would take years to conclude. They were so complicated that it could take a very long period of time to get all the approvals and everything to go through. But certainly putting together a bid and a proposal and evaluation of that nature wasn't done in 3 days. Or if it was, then you'd already had all the information in advance, so you could go through everything rapidly and get to the bottom of what these things were worth. It was impossible for Gunvor to be able to do that. So the only way that they could have cut a deal with Lukoil is by having very close relations with the owners of Lukoil. And Lukoil is obviously a Russian business. It's the largest private business in Russia. It's the second largest oil company in Russia. It's very important to the Russian economy. So President Putin knows about Lukoil. He will know all of the people who run Lukoil. I'm sure he's had a lot of conversations with all of those guys. So the deal that was struck with Gunvor had to be approved by President Putin. There is no way that he was unaware of this deal being struck. And as we talked about, Gunvor's history is that it was established by one of his close colleagues, basically one of the oligarchs. When Russia was formed after the breakup of the Soviet Union, lots of Russian businessmen benefited from all of the big assets in the Soviet Union being privatized. And many of those individuals became extremely wealthy because they were given all of these companies. So that's essentially what Gunvor was done. It was an oligarch who was already doing quite well for himself, decided that Russia needed an overseas trading arm for its oil that was technically not Russian. So it's based in Switzerland. It looks like a Swiss company. You bring in a guy from Sweden, so it looks very Scandinavian. And then you basically put all of the oil flows through it, and suddenly you're turning over $40 billion within a very short space of time. It looks like a great company, but when you trace the lineage and the heritage, it's essentially a Russian company that's been established overseas. Now, the Russian founder had to exit before he was hit with sanctions, because otherwise he would have lost all of his value in the company. So he was bought out. So on paper, when you just look at it, it's a Swiss-based company run by a Swedish guy, but actually it's still got extremely strong links to Russia. And the fact that it did this deal within 3 days with Lukoil tells you that it's still very close to Lukoil. So there was no way that the US authorities were going to allow this deal to go through, because they would need to sign off on everything. And there's just absolutely no way that they were going to do that. But also, why would they allow Lukoil to receive a payment of $22 billion? Because the chief executive of Gunvor said that it wasn't benefiting Russia. However, it would have, because they've got $22 billion under the terms of what was agreed. So Lukoil now will not get anything. It won't get 1 cent of value for any of these overseas assets. And these assets are really important to all of the different countries they're located in. For the reasons we discussed earlier, you need to keep operating them, because Lukoil didn't have 100% ownership of most of its upstream assets, all of those oil and gas fields. They're still operating. They're still pulling lots of oil and gas out of the ground. So the other owners, the people who own the other percentages, need to keep moving forward. So they need Lukoil off the books. They need to not be sanctioned. They can't afford to be hit with sanctions. So they need to get rid of all of the Russian involvement. So I think what's likely is that these assets will be deemed to be needed for national security purposes in all of those countries. They can then be nationalized in the same way that Russia has been nationalizing lots of assets in Russia that were owned by overseas owners at the time when the war in Ukraine started. So that's what's been happening in Russia. That will now happen in places like Bulgaria, Romania, Kazakhstan. So all of these assets will change ownership. No payments will be made to Lukoil or the Russian state. And what will happen here is that Lukoil will shrink in size. It already has. It's reduced its revenue. It's reduced its overseas income in terms of foreign currency. That's bad news for Lukoil, because obviously it's shrinking. It's also bad news for the Russian economy because it's the second largest oil producer and exporter in Russia. So it's a really big player. Lots of people are employed by Lukoil, so they're now at risk of potentially losing their jobs. Lukoil will make less revenue, less profit, it will pay less tax. So that's bad news for the Russian authorities. But in addition to that, Russia's also damaged reputationally because it's shrinking in terms of its global presence in the oil market. It's no longer a big player. And I think the direct sanctions that were applied against both Rosneft and Lukoil are really starting to hurt Russian businesses and the Russian economy. So the overall summary of today's video is that the Gunvor deal to buy all of Lukoil's overseas assets that I talked about in a recent video has now fallen away. It's been completely blown out of the water by the US authorities. And I don't think anybody else is going to come in and try to resurrect this deal. So Lukoil has lost all of its overseas assets. It won't receive any value for it. It won't get any more future cash flow. And this is damaging to both Lukoil and the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. You found it useful, informative, and hopefully thought-provoking. That's what I'm trying to do, provoke some thoughts for you. So if you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already. I know that around half of the people watching these videos haven't subscribed, so just press that button. It doesn't cost you anything, but it really helps me. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and thank you so much to everyone that supported me. I really mean that. So I just received some Buy Me a Coffee today, so thank you so much for everybody that's bought me a coffee. That's such a generous act. Really appreciate it. Also, super thanks, YouTube super thanks, which is amazing. Thank you to everybody that's clicked on a super thanks and sent me some money. It just blows me away, that concept. And for the people who sign up as a patron or YouTube member or Buy Me a Coffee member, I really appreciate that long-term support. When I first started this channel, I couldn't imagine that anybody would sign up. I hadn't even heard of Patreon or YouTube membership at that point. I didn't even know what Buy Me a Coffee was. So I'm absolutely amazed that people have signed up to that. Thank you so much. It really means a lot to me. And here's something to put a smile on your face.